when Laurel Ainsworth snapped her fingers at the man near the service corridor of the Pemberton Club. Her voice carried across the marble entrance hall, with the particular edge of someone accustomed to having rooms rearrange themselves around her preferences. She did not look at him directly. She spoke past him, the way a person speaks past a door they expect to open on its own. She told him to move the cleaning cart out of the sightline of the main reception, to keep his crew away from the east hallway during cocktail hour, and to make certain that nothing about the facility looked like it required maintenance while her guests were present. Malcolm Reeve listened without expression. He set the cart back against the wall, folded his hands, and asked, in a tone that gave nothing away, whether she had had the chance to review the amendment schedule before the signature appointment the following morning. Laurel Ainsworth turned and looked at him fully for the first time. Then she laughed, the way people laugh when something does not deserve a real response. Her general counsel, Elise Tarrant, who was standing 3 steps behind her carrying a leather document folder, did not laugh at all. If you want to watch a woman who has spent 30 years collecting powerful rooms discover what happens when the most important person in one of those rooms has been mopping the floor the whole time, stay until the very end. Malcolm Reeve had spent the last 4 years learning to carry 2 lives at once, and he had grown quietly expert at both. By day, from a second-hand desk in the spare bedroom of his house in Scarborough, he worked on the platform he had started sketching on the back of maintenance log sheets not long after his wife Karen died. By night, he supervised the facilities crew at the Pemberton Club, a private members club in Midtown Toronto that hosted the kind of business receptions where wine was never under $40 and every handshake was worth something. The work was steady, it fit around his daughter's school schedule, and it asked nothing of him except that he show up and do it correctly, which had always been enough to get him through the years when correct was the only thing he could manage. His daughter Josie was 16 now, sharp and skeptical in the way of teenagers who have had to grow up faster than they planned. She did homework at the kitchen table while Malcolm made dinner, and she had the habit of asking questions that sounded casual and landed with precision. The night of the Ainsworth Gala, she asked him, without looking up from her geography textbook, whether he thought the deal would actually go through this time. Malcolm said he didn't know yet. Josie said she thought it would. She had the same confidence in him that her mother had carried, quiet and total, and it still caught him off guard sometimes to see it sitting so naturally in a face that looked so much like Karen's. Medtrace had started as a problem Malcolm could not stop thinking about. He had watched Karen spend the last year of her life coordinating care between 4 different specialists in 3 different hospitals, each of them working from incomplete records because the systems would not communicate with each other. The information existed. The need was urgent. The tools to connect them simply didn't. After she died, he had gone back to work, first because he needed the money, and then because the structure of a shift kept him from disappearing into the quiet of an apartment that had grown too large. But the problem stayed with him. He started writing code late at night, refining it through slow shifts, testing it on weekends while Josie slept in. Medtrace was a data integration platform designed to give smaller clinics and rural health centers real-time access to specialist consultation networks, working across incompatible systems without requiring any facility to replace its existing infrastructure. By the time it caught the attention of investors and health technology executives, it had already done its most important work. It had carried Malcolm and Josie through the hardest years of their lives by giving him something precise and necessary to build. The Pemberton Club had been Malcolm's place of work for 7 years. Carol Theus, who owned it, had been friends with Karen and remained one of the steadier presences in Malcolm's life afterward. She ran the club with the calm authority of someone who had learned early that a well-run room required attention to every detail, including the people who maintained it. When the reservation came through from Ainsworth Health Group for a corporate reception, Carol pulled Malcolm aside in the linen storage room and told him gently that the name on the booking was the same company scheduled to sign with Medtrace the following morning. She offered to reassign him for the night. Malcolm told her he'd prefer to stay. He had been keeping his identity out of the negotiations from the beginning, precisely because he wanted to observe how Ainsworth's people conducted themselves before the ink was dry. Carol looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded and said she would keep the East Bar fully stocked. Simon Dacre, who had been Malcolm's legal counsel since the early investor conversations, sent a message at 7 that evening confirming that the Ainsworth board had given formal approval to the $90 million acquisition, and that Malcolm's signature was the only remaining step. Malcolm read it in the staff corridor, slid his phone back into his chest pocket, and went to check that the reception tables were properly set. Laurel Ainsworth arrived 15 minutes late, which Malcolm suspected was a preference rather than an accident. She entered the Pemberton's main hall, as though the building had been waiting for her, paused to survey the room, and immediately identified 3 things she wanted changed. The floral arrangement on the registration table was obscuring her company's branded display. The ambient lighting in the east hallway was 2 shades warmer than the tone she had specified, and the man with the cleaning cart near the service corridor was visible from the main entrance, which was unacceptable for an event of this profile. The third complaint was directed at Malcolm himself, though she did not ask his name or wait for a response before moving toward the reception. For the next 2 hours, Malcolm worked the room the way he always did, quietly and without disruption. He managed a spill before anyone noticed it. He redirected a catering error before it reached the wrong table. When a younger member of his crew grew visibly unsettled after Ainsworth's COO, Grant Moffat, made a loud and unnecessary comment about the temperature of the room, Malcolm stepped in and took the adjustment request himself. He was not trying to protect anyone from embarrassment. It was simply the kind of person he had always been. The difficulty came midway through the evening, when Moffat held court near the center of the room and made a series of confident and substantially incorrect statements about data integration architecture to a circle of executives who were nodding along too quickly. The particular error was one that had cost 2 Canadian health networks several years and several $1 million to undo, and Malcolm knew the exact sequence of decisions that had produced it. He said quietly, from the position of someone refilling a water glass nearby, that the model Moffat was describing had already been field-tested at scale in Alberta, and had created exactly the interoperability gaps it was designed to prevent. He said it without drama, the way he said most things. Moffat looked at him with the expression of a man who had been interrupted by furniture, and Laurel Ainsworth, who had been standing at the edge of that circle, turned and looked at Malcolm with something that had shifted past irritation into a colder register entirely. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was quiet enough that the words carried to every table in the immediate vicinity, and she knew it. "This is a business reception," she said. "People like you keep the rooms clean. People like us close the deals." Malcolm looked at her. He did not lower his eyes, and he did not change his expression, and the stillness of him in that moment seemed to frustrate her more than any argument could have. "I hope the morning works for you," he said. "I'd like to get the agreement settled before noon." Ainsworth laughed. The laugh was the kind designed to make a room feel complicit. Several people in the circle smiled reflexively. Grant Moffat added something under his breath that drew another small wave of obliging laughter, and, for a moment, Malcolm became the evening's easy joke. The maintenance man who apparently thought he had opinions about health policy. He did not give anyone the satisfaction of reacting. He cleared the nearest table and kept moving. What came next was a sequence of smaller cruelties that individually might have passed as negligence, but together formed a pattern Malcolm recognized from other rooms he had worked over the years. Ainsworth complained formally to Carol about the quality of the facility's service. She requested Malcolm specifically be relocated to a part of the building away from the main reception. She made a remark, loudly enough to be overheard, that the Pemberton relied entirely on the goodwill of clients exactly like her, and that this reliance might need to be reconsidered. Carol listened to each item without flinching and told her, evenly, that the facility's staff had performed to the club's standard throughout the evening, and that she had no concerns. It was while Ainsworth was still mid-complaint that Simon Dacre came through the front entrance alongside Elise Tarrant, Ainsworth's general counsel. Both of them were arriving early to walk through the final signature documents before morning. Simon spotted Malcolm across the room with a rolling cart in hand, and his expression shifted with a speed that told its own story. He did not call out. He simply looked at Tarrant, and Tarrant followed his gaze. And something in her face changed in a way that had nothing to do with surprise, and everything to do with the arithmetic of a situation that had just become very different. Ainsworth was still speaking when Tarrant stepped forward and addressed her directly, with the particular care of a lawyer, delivering information she knows cannot be unsaid. "Laurel," she said, "the man you asked to be relocated is Malcolm Reeve." Ainsworth stopped speaking. For several seconds, she appeared to be running the name through some internal system that kept returning no results. Then the results arrived, and her face did something complicated that she was not quite fast enough to control. Simon explained it plainly, and without softening it. Malcolm Reeve was the sole founder of Reeve Health Technologies, and the only person with the authority to execute the acquisition agreement scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. Tarrant opened her document folder, glanced between the photo on the identification page and the man standing across the room, and put the folder closed again with the particular care of someone buying themselves a moment to think. Ainsworth said the situation was absurd. She said it had to be a misunderstanding or some kind of setup. Malcolm walked across the room to where they were standing, set down the cart handle, and told her that he had worked at the Pemberton for 7 years, before MedTrace was worth a conversation, and that he hadn't orchestrated the evening to make any kind of point about anyone's character. He said what concerned him wasn't the remark itself. It was the assumption underneath it, the assumption that the work a person does in public is the total measure of what that person is. Ainsworth's expression moved from shock to calculation in the time it takes a good negotiator to find a new position. She offered to increase the acquisition to $97 million. She offered a private acknowledgement of the evening's events, structured as a personal apology, but worded to leave no legal record. She suggested that Grant Moffat had been responsible for the evening's tone, and that she was prepared to address that internally in whatever manner Malcolm felt was appropriate. She proposed, finally, that the whole thing could simply be understood as a misunderstanding between professionals who had met under unusual circumstances. Malcolm listened to all of it. Then he turned to Simon and asked him to send the formal notice that Reeve Health Technologies was withdrawing entirely from the acquisition process with Ainsworth Health Group. The money on the table, $90 million, growing, collapsed without a signature ever touching the page. Ainsworth said something to him as she gathered her things, low enough that no one else heard it. She said he had just made the most expensive decision of his life and that she would make certain every serious buyer in the sector understood exactly why the deal had fallen through. He watched her leave and understood that the real difficulty had not yet started. By the following morning, Ainsworth Health Group's communications office had released a statement describing a breakdown in negotiations caused by an inventor who had attached personal conditions to a commercial agreement at the 11th hour. Malcolm's name appeared in 2 industry newsletters before noon. Both pieces noted that he worked as a facility supervisor and both implied, without quite stating, that Midtrace's valuation had been inflated by investor enthusiasm rather than actual market readiness. Grant Moffat contacted several of Malcolm's smaller investors directly and suggested that the Ainsworth withdrawal was a signal about the platform's real prospects. Two of those investors called Malcolm's office within 24 hours. Carol Theas received a wave of negative reviews across multiple platforms within a single afternoon, each of them written in the particular register of people who had not actually visited the Pemberton. Two corporate accounts canceled standing reservations without explanation. Carol did not complain to Malcolm. She simply became quieter, and he watched the small adjustments she made around the club in the days that followed. The earlier hours, the extra attention to every booking, and understood what they meant. Josie noticed her father differently during those weeks. Not worse, exactly, but changed in a way she was too perceptive to ignore. She asked him one evening, while they were cleaning up after dinner, whether he was sure it was worth it. Not challenging him, just asking honestly, the way she always did. He told her he wasn't sure about everything, but that some things you stayed with not because you were certain, but because the alternative was a version of yourself you wouldn't recognize. Josie dried a plate and considered this for a moment, and said that sounded right, even if it was also convenient. When Howard Baines, the chair of Ainsworth's board, requested a meeting to discuss whether the withdrawal could be reconsidered, Malcolm agreed. He asked, in return, to see the full implementation plan Ainsworth had submitted during due diligence, a document he realized he had never actually been shown in complete form. The request was met with a day of silence, and then a partial file. And, when Simon compared the partial file against the due diligence index, they identified two appendices that had not been included. What Malcolm found in those appendices changed the entire shape of what he thought he understood about the deal. Ainsworth's actual operational plan for Midtrace involved designating the platform as the exclusive integration infrastructure for a network of urban specialist centers, and then implementing a tiered access pricing model that charged rural and remote health facilities a premium rate for consultation connectivity. The economic modeling in the appendix was explicit. Smaller clinics in northern Ontario, across the prairies, and in rural British Columbia would face access costs that, at full rollout, would exceed what most of those facilities could absorb without reducing services elsewhere. The document did not describe this as a flaw. It described it as a revenue opportunity. The clauses Malcolm had specifically negotiated, clauses requiring equal access pricing and prohibiting algorithmic denial of connection requests, had been stripped from the version shown to the board. Someone at Ainsworth had removed them deliberately enough that the removal was not flagged in the revision history. Malcolm sat with that for a long time. The room was quiet except for the sound of the street below, and eventually the sound of Josie coming downstairs to make tea at an hour when she should have been asleep. She brought him a cup without asking why he was still at the desk and sat on the couch with her knees pulled up, and a book she was not really reading, and neither of them said much. He had built Midtrace because a woman he loved had spent her last year navigating a system that treated her information as something to be filed rather than used. He had built it for the rural family practitioner who had to drive 3 hours to connect a patient to a specialist, because no digital pathway existed. He had built it, above all, as a tool of access rather than advantage. The thought of it becoming a mechanism for gatekeeping the very care it was designed to deliver settled in his chest with the particular weight of a betrayal he had not quite seen coming. Howard Baines dismissed the appendix as routine operational planning when Malcolm raised it directly. He suggested that access adjustments were standard practice in large-scale platform acquisitions and that Malcolm's concerns could be addressed through ongoing advisory participation. Laurel Ainsworth sent a final offer of $95 million, conditional on Malcolm issuing a joint statement describing the original withdrawal as a negotiating tactic that had since been resolved. Malcolm declined to sell an explanation he did not believe. Elise Tarrant called Simon on a Thursday evening from a number that was not her office line. She spoke carefully, with the particular phrasing of a lawyer who has thought through what she is and is not willing to say. She told Simon that Ainsworth was not simply trying to pressure Malcolm into re-engaging. She told him that Grant Moffat had retained a former contractor who had spent several months working on MedTrace's early architecture as a third-party tester. That contractor did not have the platform's complete source code, but the structural logic of MedTrace. The way it navigated between incompatible hospital record systems was sufficiently documented in the early testing materials that a version of it could be reconstructed. Ainsworth's internal team had been working on that reconstruction for 11 weeks. The plan was to announce a proprietary platform developed entirely in-house, close enough to MedTrace to serve the same market, different enough on the surface to complicate a direct infringement claim. The litigation, once started, would be designed to last longer than Reeve Health Technologies had capital to sustain. Tarrant was not willing to testify in any formal proceeding, not yet, but she gave Simon enough specificity that Malcolm's technical team had somewhere to look. When they examined the access records on their testing infrastructure, they found a series of queries on a contractor account that had pulled architectural diagrams from an early prototype archive. No source code had been copied directly, but the diagrams contained enough information about MedTrace core routing logic that someone who understood the problem space could build toward the same solution. The contractor account was linked to a consulting firm that Malcolm's security consultant, Petra Ashwood, traced through 2 shell registrations to a numbered company with Grant Moffat's name on its original filing. Rather than reporting this and ending there, Malcolm asked Petra to document the full chain of what had been accessed and where each piece had gone. A cooperative account of the breach was more useful than a clean termination. 3 weeks later, Ainsworth Health Group held a media event to announce the beta launch of what they called an internally developed data integration platform for rural health connectivity. Laurel Ainsworth presented in front of an arrangement of provincial health ministry officials and described the platform as a response to an identified gap in the national healthcare infrastructure. She referred, in passing, to a small developer who had recently withdrawn from a partnership conversation at the last minute. Someone more comfortable working in facilities than in boardrooms. And the line drew a professional kind of laughter from the people near the front. Inside the demonstration code that Ainsworth's team uploaded to the event's technical portal, Malcolm's engineers found a string of characters embedded in the routing module's initialization sequence. It was a signature Malcolm had inserted into a prototype build 3 years earlier, not as a deliberate trap, but as a habit of attribution he had carried from his first engineering job, a small way of dating his own work. Its presence in Ainsworth's demonstration build meant the routing module had not been developed independently. It had been built from materials that originated inside Reeve Health Technologies and had never been licensed or transferred. Howard Baines convened a special session of the Ainsworth board to address what had become a complex legal and reputational situation and invited Malcolm to present his findings directly. Laurel Ainsworth arrived at that meeting with the demeanor of a person who had already decided how it would go. When Malcolm walked in, she noted to no one in particular that the boardroom was not typically the venue for contractor consultations. Malcolm said he understood that. He said he thought this particular session might benefit from having someone present who knew where the code actually came from. Simon presented the evidence in sequence. The internal access records, the contractor account linked to Moffat's numbered company, The architectural diagrams that had migrated from Reeve Health Technologies' testing environment into Ainsworth's prototype development. The embedded signature string that placed the origin of the routing module unambiguously within Malcolm's own early build archive. The full text of the two appendices withheld from the board during due diligence approval, with specific reference to the stripped access equity clauses. The coordination records linking the negative review campaign against the Pemberton Club to a media relations firm contracted by Ainsworth's communications department. And finally, a recording of a conversation in which Laurel Ainsworth had described the litigation plan to a member of her legal team in terms that were not ambiguous about its purpose. Tarrant, who had arrived at the meeting without prior announcement, confirmed that the recording was authentic and had been preserved on Ainsworth's own secure legal server in its original unedited form. Ainsworth told the board the recording had been taken out of context. She told them the appendix language was standard boilerplate and had been mischaracterized. She began to redirect responsibility toward Grant Moffat, who, from his seat across the table, stated clearly, and without particular heat, that every action he had taken had been carried out under direct authorization from Ainsworth herself. Several board members were still calculating. The platform, even disputed, represented a competitive opportunity they were reluctant to surrender. One of them noted that a resolution might still be possible if Malcolm were willing to re-enter negotiation under revised terms. Malcolm told the room that the opportunity to acquire MedTrace no longer existed. He told them he had signed a different agreement that same morning. Reeve Health Technologies had entered into a licensing arrangement with a consortium of provincial health authorities and regional hospital networks representing health delivery infrastructure across 7 Canadian provinces. The arrangement was valued at $95 million over 8 years. It included a guaranteed equal access pricing structure for rural and remote facilities, a dedicated transition support fund for clinics with limited technical infrastructure, a formal prohibition on algorithmic denial of connection requests, equity participation for the 3 engineers who had built MedTrace's core architecture alongside Malcolm, ongoing audit rights retained by Reeve Health Technologies, and a standing appeals process for any facility flagged for connectivity irregularities by the system. Malcolm had not chosen the consortium because the number was marginally higher. He had chosen it because the terms reflected what the platform had always been designed to do. The Ainsworth board voted to remove Laurel Ainsworth from her position as chief executive, triggering the cause termination provisions of her contract. Given the weight of evidence that she had authorized the unauthorized use of protected intellectual property, engaged in coordinated reputational harm against a contracting party, and deliberately concealed material legal risk from the board during the due diligence approval process, she forfeited the bonus package tied to the provincial expansion initiative, surrendered unvested equity, and lost all authority to negotiate on behalf of the company in any future capacity. Grant Moffat was placed on immediate administrative suspension, pending a separate internal review. Ainsworth left the boardroom, still issuing instructions in a lowered voice, to an assistant who was no longer obligated to take them. She arrived at the Pemberton Club the following evening, where Carol had arranged a small reception for the consortium partners. Malcolm was there as a guest, and Ainsworth apparently calculated that reappearing on that ground would accomplish something she had not been able to manage in a boardroom. She told Carol directly, in the entrance hall, that the facility's staff needed to be managed more appropriately for events of this importance. Carol Theus looked at her for a moment with an expression of complete composure. "Your reservation was canceled this morning," she said. "I'm afraid this evening's event is for invited guests only, and your name isn't on the list." There was nothing theatrical about what followed. No confrontation, no raised voices. The front door staff asked Ainsworth politely to return to the sidewalk. She stood in the entrance hall for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to, and then she left, and the room went back to its conversation as if it had never paused. The agreement with the provincial consortium pulled Reeve Health Technologies back to stable ground within weeks. Malcolm allocated a portion of the new licensing revenue to reimburse the Pemberton Club for the financial damage produced by the coordinated review campaign, and he established a skills transition fund for workers in adjacent industries, logistics, manufacturing, administrative services, who wanted to retrain for roles in health technology. The 3 engineers who had built MedTrace's routing and data normalization layers received their equity shares in the form that had been promised to them since the early months of the project. Petra Ashwood's contract was renewed with a significant increase. Carol accepted a formal consulting role on the consortium's Facility Security Committee, which suited her considerably. Malcolm still came to the Pemberton on occasion, not for every shift, those days had passed, but for the evenings that ran long and needed an extra steady pair of hands, and for the particular satisfaction of a room that had been well set and was now being well used. He did not think of it as a gesture or a statement. It was simply part of how he understood himself, and that understanding had not changed because the numbers attached to his name had. On a Tuesday evening the following spring, the consortium's first quarterly data report was circulated to all partner facilities. It showed a measurable reduction in diagnostic delay for rural patients in participating networks, a notable uptake in specialist consultation through the new connectivity pathways, and zero access denials logged against any rural or remote facility in the system's first 3 months of operation. Josie read the summary over her father's shoulder at the kitchen table, and was quiet for a moment in the way she got, when she was thinking something through. "That's the whole point, isn't it?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Malcolm said that it was. She nodded and went back to the essay she was supposed to have finished an hour earlier, and Malcolm closed the report and started on dinner, and the apartment smelled of something warm on the stove, and the particular quiet of 2 people who understood each other well enough that they didn't need to say everything out loud. A family doctor running a 1-person practice in a community 8 hours from the nearest specialist center had logged into MedTrace for the first time that same week and connected a patient to a cardiology consult in under 4 minutes. She left a note in the system's feedback portal that said, simply, that this was the first time in 11 years she hadn't had to put a patient on a waiting list just to get a second opinion. Malcolm didn't see that note for several days. When he did, he read it twice, and didn't say anything about it to anyone. He just put his phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, and felt something settle in his chest that had been working its way toward that place for a long time. Laurel Ainsworth faced a sequence of civil claims from institutional shareholders over the following months. There was no criminal proceeding and no dramatic public reckoning. Only the slow, administrative unraveling of a career built on the belief that the space between her and the people who maintained her rooms was permanent and unalterable. Howard Baines eventually reached Malcolm with an offer to discuss a new arrangement, significantly revised. Malcolm told him the agreement with the consortium contained provisions that were not transferable, and that those provisions were the reason he had signed it. On a cold March evening, Carol held a small dinner at the Pemberton for the people who had stayed close through the difficult months. Simon, Petra, 2 of the MedTrace engineers, and a few others. Malcolm came in through the back entrance, the way he always had, out of habit rather than any sense of obligation to old routines, and spent an hour helping set up before anyone told him he didn't have to. Josie came with him that night. She sat near the window with her phone mostly in her pocket, watching her father move through a room he knew by feel. Straightening a fork here, adjusting a glass there, stopping to say something to Carol that made Carol laugh properly for the first time in weeks. And at some point during the evening, without Josie fully deciding to, she understood something about him that she had known in outline for years, but had never quite assembled into words. He had worked in this room for 7 years, because he had needed the structure and the mercy of a task that required nothing but his full attention. He had built the thing he built during those same years, because he could not stop trying to fix a problem that had broken something he loved. And when the moment came to choose between what he could have gained and what he had promised himself the work would protect, he had not hesitated in a way that suggested the choice had been difficult. Outside, the March wind came off Lake Ontario the way it always did at that time of year, cold and without apology. But the Pemberton's windows held the warmth in, and the room smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and Malcolm Reeve stood near the far end of the table with his hands in his jacket pockets, listening to a story someone was telling, and looking, for the first time in a long time, exactly like a man who was exactly where he had decided to be.